Assalamu alaikum and welcome to another episode on TMJ. I'm your guest host Hassan Shami, and today we are speaking with Rima Lebabidi, a geopolitical commentator with a focus on Middle Eastern affairs. Rima brings a unique perspective shaped by her personal connection to Syria, where much of her family resides. She is widely known for her insightful commentary on Syrian politics through her work on X. Let's start off with the topic of sanctions. You spoke extensively about the sanctions on your X account, and we've seen that many pro-revolution activists over the years have supported sanctions on Bashar al-Assad. And now, since the HTS takeover, you see that they're saying that these sanctions are hurting the Syrian civilians, and they're asking for them to be lifted. What do you make out of this dichotomy?
So I think it's just a perfect example of hypocrisy. So back in 2018, you saw the Caesar sanctions get passed into law. And these sanctions, when they pushed them into law, they were doing it on the basis of these photos that this, man named Caesar, which is an alias, had leaked to the US, and just these photos showed like thousands of dead bodies, right? Now, the entire basis of these sanctions was built on a lie, because what they failed to actually talk about was that how half the bodies, they said that these bodies in these photos had been killed by Bashar al-Assad, right? So the premise of these sanctions was that they were punishing this criminal, evil regime that was killing all these civilians. But what they lied about was that half of the men in those photos were security officers or Syrian soldiers, right? So they had sold this lie to justify the sanctions, saying, oh, look, Bashar al-Assad killed all these civilians. I call it economic terrorism. Why? Because they were using sanctions to basically suppress all of the Syrian economy to force political change. The idea is that if the civilian population suffers enough, they'll revolt, right? And so you have people like Dana Stroul, who was the deputy assistant, I think, director of defense or something like that. You can look her up, Dana Stroul. We have her on video saying that the combination of the U.S. occupation in Syria and the sanctions on Syria, that they were using them to leverage political change in Syria. Now, if you look up the UN Special Rapporteur on the consequences of sanctions, and I believe her name is Elena Duhan. So she has published reports saying how sanctions are essentially a crime against humanity, right? When you're sanctioning an entire economy, sanctioning 20 million civilians, it's a crime against humanity, because you're suppressing the economy, plunging people into starvation. These sanctions put 90% of the Syrian population under the poverty line, right? But you would have these free Syrian activists, as I call them, like Salim Qassem, Karim Rifai, Muaz Mustafa, a lot of them working with the SETF, justifying these sanctions, lobbying for them, right? You have Syrians in the diaspora working with the US government, lobbying for sanctions against their own country to enact political change, knowing full well that their people in Syria will starve because of them. And that's exactly what happened. The entire Bank of Syria was sanctioned, right? We couldn't even, when the earthquake hit in 2023, we couldn't even send money directly to our family members while their homes are collapsed. And they have nothing, and we couldn't even send money to them. We have to go through back channels, and this is the result of the sanctions. The central bank was sanctioned. There were anything that basically Syria was cut off from the entire world. So hospitals in Syria couldn't get replacement parts for hospital equipment, say MRI machines and stuff like this. For example, Syrian airlines, they couldn't get replacement parts for the airplanes. So flights became very rare to any countries that would receive a flight from Syria. It was horrific. And they did this for what? For political change. So it's just an example of hypocrisy, because they would lie and be like, oh, this only targets the government, but what are we seeing now? Now we see HTS putting out statements saying, because they issue temporary licenses, the OFAC right now, and for just 6 months. And so they suspended a few provisions of those sanctions to allow people to send aid, specifically, for example, Saudi or Qatar want to send money now. They can do that. They won't get punished, because these sanctions didn't just target the Syrian economy. Anyone who engaged in trade with Syria would get sanctioned too. So if Saudi or Qatar had done business with Syria, then they would be sanctioned in response, punished for it. So now these limited waivers that they've issued allow Qatar and Saudi to send money, allows them to do trade specifically with the new HTS government, And it also, they temporarily lifted the sanctions on the Syrian National Bank. So now remittances, people can send money, right? Because before, people couldn't even send money. Like, imagine you have to go pay cash everywhere because there's no digital banking system. Like, it was catastrophic. And now you see them backwalking it, being like, oh, these same Free Syrians who were like, don't lift the sanctions during the earthquake. They were lobbying against lifting the sanctions during the earthquake. Now they're like, please lift the sanctions. We need the sanctions lifted. These are hurting the Syrian people. It's just pure hypocrisy. Because for years, they pretended like the sanctions didn't hurt the people when we all knew that was a lie. Like, if I can't even send money to my family, then obviously you're lying. And then, and now they're like, oh, we need to lift the sanctions. Like, the Bashar al-Assad is gone. Like, they punished an entire population of 20 million people. They deliberately impoverished 20 million people for years.
So we see a little bit. We actually see many people on X posting about the hypocrisy, not only with that, but also with the torture, right? So like many people have spoken about the torture that the Assad regime have done on the Syrian civilians that many of us will not deny, but they turn a blind eye to the torture of Jolani. And you have actually posted on X many times about Jolani having torture dungeons in Idlib, and also used to send suicide bombers to civilian markets. Now you see Jolani walking in the streets, expressing solidarity with the people, embracing diversity, wearing a shirt and tie, meeting with Western officials. I mean, what do you make? What do you take out of this makeover?
I mean, so Jolani, right? So before he was like HTS before was known as before they were branded in 2017 was Jabhat al-Nusra, right? And even Amnesty International in 2015, 2014 was reporting on how Jabhat al-Nusra, like there are reports you can go find on Amnesty International's website, where they said they were surprised to learn that the opposition started using the same methods of torture that they had accused the government of doing. And this is something that I've talked about many times because my family's from Halab. And when Jabhat al-Nusra ruled Halab from 2012 to 2016, half of Halab, the eastern half, they were torturing people in the hospitals. There was like an American journalist that they captured and tortured under the eye hospital, right? They were torturing people in schools. The US State Department and the UN, in their reports on human rights in Syria, have both documented extensively how Jolani himself has a very long track record of forced disappearances, of extrajudicial executions, and torture, and not just of men, of women too. So if you look up the U.S. State Department reports on religious freedom in Idlib, they documented how for years Jolani was persecuting people. He massacred an entire village of Druze. They were stealing properties of Christians. Anyone who protested against Jolani up until this year, right? Like when Jolani was parading around in Damascus, people in Idlib were still protesting the release of their family they were imprisoned in Idlib just this year from protesting against him. So the same thing, how people are like, oh, Bashar al-Assad imprisoned people who were protesting. Well, Jolani did the same thing.
You're saying just this year before the HTS takeover.
Yes, this year. There are still people in his prisons rotting away, and their only crime was protesting. The Syrian Observatory of Human Rights, acronym is SOHR, has extensively reported this. Go on their website and just search it, and you'll see that up until November, they were reporting how HTS was imprisoning people who were protesting against them.
And you mentioned SOHR. SOHR is also maybe pro-revolution as well, right? So these same people, people are documenting what Jolani was doing pre-takeover.
Imagine that, right? So if I'm using their source, right? So the founder of SOHR was imprisoned in Syria for many years. So I think he went to prison 4 separate times under the Assads. And so he has always, he's a staunch anti-Assad, always against the government. So for him to report on these crimes that Jolani is committing in Idlib is significant. Because by his own admission, the opposition he supported is committing these crimes against humanity, these war crimes, imprisoning people, torturing them to death, stealing properties of minorities, massacring entire villages of minorities, torturing women to death. This is all reported on their own website.
Yeah, we saw the videos of, I think, one of the new elected officials or one of the judges who was taking part.
The new Minister of Justice. The new Minister of Justice was recorded in a video extrajudicially executing women in the streets for, I believe,
a claim of adultery.
Yes, something like this, right? And when this video went viral, and people asked the new Minister of Justice or the new ministry, for clarification, they admitted, yes, he did this, but this was just a phase. This is the phrasing that they keep using, that this was just a phase and now Syria's in a new phase. That when he was executing women with a bullet to the head in the street, with men screaming, like, what kind of, is this a dignified death, right? To just shoot a woman in the, like, two women, right? There were two women he executed in the middle of the street, surrounded by people, right? They recorded it and published it. Right? What kind of dignified death if this is, right? Like, even if we go to, according to the Sharia and all this stuff, right? Even if they had full justification, you know, because some people allege that she was running a prostituting children or something like this, that she was, I've seen different allegations against her, but just the method of the way they did it, it was an example of pure barbarism. Like, you know, it was not dignified in any way. And now this man is the Minister of Justice. And if you look at his CV, he doesn't even have like a normal law degree. He only has a degree in Sharia that he got from Idlib University a few years ago.
Under the Jolani camp.
Yes, under Jolani's educational system in Idlib, he got a degree in Sharia, like I think 2021. Okay, and now 4 years later, he's the Minister of Justice. And something people don't know about Syria is that Syria has had a parallel governing system. So there were parallel courts. So there was like Sharia courts for like Muslims to go handle their family affairs, family law. And then there were other courts for Christians. There was another court for the Druze, right? So that different groups could adjudicate their issues, like their family law, personal law, according to their own set of like religious laws, right? And for us now to have a Minister of Justice who doesn't know anything about these other like legal systems, right? He doesn't know anything about the criminal law or anything like this, right? He only knows Islamic Sharia, which isn't applied to the Christians, isn't applied to, like, in Syria had a very sizable Christian population before the war, 15%. He doesn't know any of these things. He only knows Islamic Sharia. And he only learned it, like, not that long ago. And now he's the Minister of Justice. Like, imagine this.
Well, you mentioned something else that's very important. You said your family's from Halab. And so do you currently have family there right now?
Yeah, so most of my family like didn't leave Syria. So most of my mom's siblings are all still in Syria. Most of them are in Halab. We also have some relatives in Damascus.
And so I think it's fair to ask you, so with having family there, what is the public opinion of this HTS takeover? What's going on in Syria? How do they feel about this?
So I think to answer this question first, we have to touch on like the fact that Syrians generally, after like 15 years or 50 years of like, you know, being ruled under two men, there's very little political awareness. So 50 years combined under Hafez al-Assad and his son Bashar al-Assad. So 50 years of only knowing one political party, right? Of just knowing this one family ruling over you, right? At the end of the day, Syrians have had a, like, and even before that, even before Hafez al-Assad, you know, Syrian political awareness was being suppressed by the French occupation, by the Ottomans, right? Like the Ottomans were known for executing Syrian political leaders. That's why they have the Martyrs Square and in Damascus, that was the French that were executing people. You know, Jemal Pasha was known as the butcher of Syria because he was just butchering people who would go against the Ottoman. That's why you saw like the Arab Revolt. Then you had the Great Syrian Revolt against the French occupation. And then after that, Syria went through a period of severe political instability. There were coups. The first democratically elected president of Syria, I believe his name was Shukri Quwatli. He was overthrown by the CIA in 1951 and replaced with Hosni al-Zayem. And Hosni al-Zayem's first acts as president were to normalize with Israel and approve licenses for American oil companies in Syria, right? And within 2 months, he was overthrown by the Syrian people. And Syria saw like a full 2 decades of political instability where it was coup and then counter coup and coup and counter coup. And in reality, it was like whoever had the military power had power over Syria. And, you know, Syria joined with Egypt to form the UAR because they were just desperate for political stability. It failed. It only lasted about 2.5 years. So because of all this turmoil over the last 100 years, Syria has had a very like low level of political awareness because of so much instability. Like, how can people think about all these diverse political systems when they don't have the basic stability that they need, right? You can't even stabilize the economy because of it. You can't even industrialize the country. You can't build roads and infrastructure and send people to school and all this stuff when you have such political instability. And so now people are kind of coming out of the yoke of like both post-colonialism, coming out of a dictatorship, and everyone's like relieved, especially coming out of 14 years of war. The men are relieved that for the first time since 1948, there's no conscription. Can you imagine? Since 1948, Syrian men have been forcibly conscripted into the army, right? And in the last 14 years, you had men that were serving 7, 8 years, and now for the first time, men are waking up and like, I can go to school, I can pick a career, I can get married, I can have a family. I'm not going to like get killed after getting conscripted in the army.
So would you say Syrians are happy about the HTS takeover, or are you saying they're not aware of what's really going on, or they just feel a sense of relief? I mean,
they just feel like it's mostly like most of their day-to-day lives haven't changed, right? The only thing that's really changed is the men aren't getting conscripted anymore. Like people don't have to, that knife isn't hanging over their heads, but their day-to-day lives are much the same. If anything, economic conditions only worsen because Jolani cut the subsidies for like wheat and flour and oil and sugar, right? Like because Syria was a socialist country, that there were subsidies on these goods for civilians, and those subsidies have been cut. There is some growing resentment because now Jolani has fired all of the government employees. They've all been sent home. Government employees haven't been receiving their salaries. But overall, there's still a sense of relief because now people, I think it's called like a false sense of freedom, right? Like people just are like, for once, we're not seeing the face of Bashar al-Assad everywhere we go,
But are many Syrians, are they aware of Jolani, or just people from Idlib were aware of who this man is?
Yeah, only really people in Idlib knew who he was. And when Halab was being taken over, the attack on Halab was happening, and then HTS successfully took over Halab. We were talking to my aunts there, and they were like, nobody knew who Jolani was, right? Because Jolani was his kunya, right? Abu Muhammad al-Jolani, right? And it's like derived from his family allegedly being from the Golan Heights. But nobody had, like, my aunts were like, who is he? We've never heard of him. They're like, oh, maybe he's like, the people were spreading word, oh, he's Jabhat al-Nusra. And then they were remembering, oh, what did Jabhat al-Nusra do in Halab for 4 years when they ruled it, and they were terrified, they were hysterical. Like people were like asking questions like, who is this man? Now people are learning, oh, his real name is Ahmed Hussein al-Shara, right? But for weeks, people had no idea what his real name was. They didn't know him. Only people who were directly under his thumb in Idlib actually knew anything about him. And even then, his history is obscure. Why? Because like if we look at his history, he went and he fought in Iraq, right? He was the deputy commander of ISIS under Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, right? And then he broke away from Baghdadi because he wanted to do his own thing, and he started this Syrian branch of al-Qaeda in Suriah called Jabhat al-Nusra, right? So like the first, like from 2000, he also was imprisoned in the American prison in Camp Bucca for years. We don't know how long he was there, but he was there. And conveniently, all of the big ISIS and al-Qaeda leaders all were imprisoned there together, right? So like this man, for the first, like he didn't come to Syria until 2011. So from 2000 to 2011, he was in Iraq, or 2001 to 2011. So first 10 years he spent in Iraq. And now he's the de facto president of Syria, right? Like people didn't know who he was. Like I didn't know who he was I only knew because I knew Jabhat al-Nusra, but besides that, nobody knew like, who he was before the war. People didn't know what village he's from, which is very strange in Syria. Like in Syria, like you can just like, your aunties can pick up the phone and start calling people and they'll find out everything about your entire lineage as long as they have your family name. Like they'll just start asking around, they'll find out what village you're from, what your great-grandfather did for a living, what your great-great, like they'll know everything. They'll know all the tea, all the gossip about your family. They'll know who your brothers, your sisters are, everything about you. But people, for the first few weeks, they had no idea who he was. And then all of a sudden we start seeing videos of him visiting what was allegedly his old school in Damascus, even though he says he's from the Jonan. Very, like, there's a lot of mystery around him, but now we see, like, this whole media PR campaign to try to legitimize him and really make him seem like a man of the people. Already, like, I hate to say this, but Syrians are acting like sheep. Like, they're already putting up his photo everywhere. So they went from having photos of Bashar al-Assad all over Syria, which is so cringe, right? Like, everywhere you look, there was a photo of Bashar al-Assad. Like, it was in people's homes, in the schools, everywhere. Like, I used to think this is just so absurd. And now they're putting up photos of Jolani, glorifying him, idolizing him the same way. And it's like they didn't even know who he was a few weeks ago, right?
So with the lack of political awareness in Syria, I think it's important that we touch up now on the U.S. involvement. So the U.S. is allies with the Kurds, and they established themselves in Syria after they bombed Raqqa in 2016, where they carpet bombed ISIS, which is a little off because from the reports we see that they also were supporting and funding ISIS for some time. But why did the U.S. take this approach and to ally with the Kurds in that region?
So, according to Dana Stroll, they wanted to. Syria before the war was a self-sustaining country. Syria was an exporter of wheat, right? So that means the country produced enough wheat to sustain itself and then export. Syria was also an exporter of petroleum. So that means Syria had enough petroleum and oil to meet its own energy needs and then an excess to export. So these are the two pillars of a self-sustaining country: bread and energy, right? If a country has enough of both on its own, then it can be independent, financially independent, right? Because of what a lot of countries, we see in Europe, they're having the energy crisis, right? Because they're getting cut off from Russian gas because they were dependent on it. Well, in Syria, the US recognized that if they could cut off the Syrian government from those natural resources that sustain the country economically, because imagine if you have sanctions on a country, but the country still has its own oil, its own wheat, right? Then it doesn't matter because they're like, hey, we don't import our energy and we don't import our bread. We're fine. We can sustain our population this way, right? So the U.S. recognized this. They're like, okay, if we really want to handicap the Syrian government, cut off their war effort, really just economically handicap them and cripple them, then we need to cut off the Syrian government from those resources. And coincidentally, most of those resources, like the wheat fields and all this, the most fertile regions where the hydrocarbons are, everything is on the eastern side of the Euphrates. So they used the natural demarcation of the Euphrates River and took that entire 1/3 of Syria to cut off the Syrian government from those resources. And then as a plus side, they worked with the Kurds because the Kurds are not only in Syria, they're a minority in Syria, but they're also in Iraq, right? And Turkey. So there's a Kurdish pipeline that goes from Kirkuk to the port in Turkey where the Azerbaijani oil goes down to Israel. So they basically cut off the Syrian government from its resources, from the gas, the oil, and the wheat. And then they took advantage of this and they're like, okay, well, you know what? Our buddy Israel needs oil. So a lot of people don't know this, but the Kurds actually sell the Syrian oil that they steal, right, under the auspices of the U.S. government and the U.S. troops. They sell it to Israel. So what happens is they extract it from Syria, they put it into tankers, which are then trucked over the border to Iraq, to Kirkuk, and that's where the pipeline is open. Then the oil gets pumped from Kirkuk all the way to the port in Turkey, where it meets the oil that's being sent from Azerbaijan, and then it goes onto these big tanker ships and goes down to Haifa. So 1/3, or I think it's actually more like 25% of Israel's oil that they're receiving comes from Syria. So imagine, not only are you able to cripple the Syrian economy, the Syrian government, cut off their war effort, right? Because they don't even have energy. Syrians don't even have heat in their homes. They don't have fuel for the cars, nothing, right? So how are you going to do a war? So in one stride, you're able to cripple the government. And then on the other side, you're able to benefit your best buddy in Israel. They're getting really cheap, free oil. The Kurds get a little money from it, but Israel, at the end of the day, they're benefiting extremely from this. And this is all done under the auspices of Masoud Barzani. So he's a big Kurdish leader. And so this is why they use the AUMF to justify intervening in Syria, destroying ISIS, right? So the AUMF was passed September 28th of 2001, and it basically justifies U.S. military intervention anywhere where the terrorists who were responsible for 9/11 are. So they basically said, okay, ISIS is the same as al-Qaeda, so we can bomb Syria, let's get involved. And then they use that justification to build these military bases that you have in eastern Syria now. They have a base in Al-Tanaf. Basically, wherever there's resources in Syria, you'll see a U.S. base.
So with the U.S.'s involvement, stealing some resources, and then you have Israel taking more land in Syria. and also benefiting from the oil theft by the Kurds. And then you have Qatar working on some type of pipeline to Europe. What do you see for the Syrians in the future? Do you believe Syrians are going to be able to decide of their future for their nation without foreign intervention, or do you believe it's just going to be another Libya? Like, how do you see this, in the future?
So I think first we have to notate that, like, for sovereignty, for a country to have sovereignty, you have to be able to defend your country, right? So effectively, after the fall of Bashar al-Assad, Syria has been completely demilitarized. All HTS has are some RPGs, some machine guns, some artillery, and that's it. They have nothing else of any significance to defend against a foreign invasion, right? If Israel, with its nuclear weapons, with its high-tech, defense systems and all this stuff, if Israel just woke up one day and said, hey, we want to take all of Syria, really, there would be very minimal resistance. All you're going to have is a bunch of guys with like AK-47s defending against a nuclear armed country, right? With the full backing of the US. So at this point, and I think everyone needs to recognize this, that Syrians have no real sovereignty, right? Israel invaded more of Syria. And in doing so, they took, I believe it's 30% of Syria's water. 30% of Syria's water has now been taken by Israel since the fall of Bashar al-Assad, right? Syria's oil and wheat are occupied by the US and the Kurds. You have Turkey occupying land from the north. So ultimately, the Syrian people are beholden to whoever is going to dictate, whoever has, because they have no like military power, right? Their economy is still sanctioned, right? They only temporarily, for 6 months, lifted a few provisions of the sanctions. The bulk of the sanctions are still in effect, right? So they don't have any economic independence. They're still heavily indebted, still dirt poor. I mean, the electricity situation I've heard is getting worse, and tariffs have shot up. So now with the subsidies being cut, like the economic situation is worse for the average people. And they're not going to be able to like really fight off anything. So they're really at the whims and at the mercy of whatever powers like seek to take advantage of the situation. And so I think right now, like, there are two paths that Syria can go down. I think we see this like concerted effort to legitimize Jolani happening in the Western media. They're kind of painting him as this DEI candidate. We see him, he went from wearing like military outfits to he trimmed his beard, got a haircut. Now he's wearing suits. He's wearing like European leather shoes, fancy Rolexes. He's gone through full media training. And I think what we're seeing is the West is trying to see if people will swallow it, if they will legitimize Jolani, right? Because if they will legitimize Jolani, then the US can just pass it off, be like, okay. And at that point, it depends on whether he plays ball. Okay, is Jolani going to bite too much from the hand that's feeding him? Right? The hand that fed him these 14 years of war, that armed him, that sent him money, right? Let's not forget Operation Timber Sycamore, right? Where the CIA spent more than $1 billion a year, right? Which is the most expensive operation in the entire CIA history supporting the opposition, right? So Jolani was getting CIA support all these years. Then the DOD was also running a parallel program to arm the opposition too. So he's getting funded and supported by Turkey. He's getting funded and supported by Qatar. So at this point, it's going to be about how much power Jolani wants for himself, right? Because at the end of the day, I think the new rulers in Syria really only care about enriching themselves, right? They have the power now. They're going to line their pockets. And the path of Syria is going to hinge on whether he plays ball completely with the Western powers, or if he bites off too much. Because if he bites off too much, they still have HTS designated as a terrorist organization. So at any moment, as long as HTS is still designated...
Didn't they lift that?
They lifted his bounty. The FBI lifted his bounty. Why? Because U.S. officials went to Damascus and met with him. So imagine if the U.S. officials are meeting with him in Damascus. 2 separate occasions, U.S. diplomats visited.
But they're still labeled as a terrorist organization.
Yes, they're still labeled as a terrorist organization by the EU, and by the US. So at any point, they can be like, hey, this is a terrorist organization, we need to remove them. And that's why you saw the European diplomats putting out statements, including, I think, Keir Starmer, saying that they will consider lifting the designation based on HTS's actions. The latest UN Security Council meeting, they were debating this, right? They were saying, okay, like we're going to see what HTS does, because if there's a lot of sectarian killings, like if they can't market HTS as a legitimate political party, then it's all going to fall apart. So it's really dependent. One, they can use the terrorist designation as a weapon against Jolani and against the Syrians at any moment. Like if at any moment he says no to them, they can be like, oh, you're a terrorist, and they can go bomb the shit out of them,
So let me ask you this. You mentioned, Israel occupying more land in Syria and taking up about 30% of their fresh water. But Jolani's governor of Damascus has recently expressed the fact that he wants better relationships with Israel. So put aside the government, do you believe the Syrian people themselves will accept this? Do you believe they'll revolt against it?
So there's a matter of like Syrian pride, right? Where like since the inception of Israel, since Sykes-Picot, Syrians have really revolted against the continuous partitioning of Syria, right? Like Palestine was part of us, right? Like those are our brothers and sisters. Like they were against Sykes-Picot. Like if you look at the King Crane Commission, 85% of the people in Bilad al-Sham, right, which is the Levant, were for a united Greater Syria. But still, the commission went against those findings, and the people were partitioned. And ever since then, like Syrians have always been against this like Zionist entity in the region. But after 14 years of war, and just sanctions after sanctions, imagine all the wars that Syria has fought against Israel, right? Syrians fought in 1948, Syrians fought in 1967, Syrians fought in 1973. In 1979, Syrians were sanctioned for the first time for supporting and arming Palestinian resistance by the US. Syrians fought in the invasion of Lebanon in 1982, 1983, right? Syria was involved a little bit in 2006, right? They opened up the weapons warehouses in 2006 to help Hezbollah. And then Syria was punished again because of that, right? And then you got 14 years of proxy war. So if you just think about it in the grand scheme of it, like Syria has suffered a lot for its resistance against Israel. The sanctions, just the continuous wars.
And are you saying that 14-year proxy war by Western intelligence is because of their opposition to Israel?
Absolutely. I mean, we had the former prime minister of Israel, Ehud Olmert, in 2020 in an interview with RT News. He says that if Syria had accepted the peace deal, if Bashar al-Assad had accepted the peace deal he offered in 2007, okay, because Ehud Olmert was the prime minister of Israel at this time, he said, if Bashar al-Assad had accepted my deal in 2007, the war in Syria never would have happened. He said this in 2020. You have countless Israeli politicians. I mean, when Bashar al-Assad fell, what did we see Netanyahu doing? Yet Netanyahu took credit for it, right? He took credit for the fall of Bashar al-Assad. Like the U.S. role, the Zionist role, and the war in Syria. Like the Israeli officials admitted to funding, I think it was 8 or 12 factions of the Syrian opposition. Right? Netanyahu was videoed meeting injured Syrian opposition fighters, right? Because opposition fighters in Syria were getting medical care in Israel, right? They would get wounded in fighting and then cross the Jolan and go get medical care in Israel. Imagine this. Syrian rebels were getting medical care by the Israelis. And Netanyahu went to the hospital and he met with them and he shook their hands. This is on video. You have the countless evidence of Israeli weapons with Hebrew on them being found in Syria. They publicly funded and paid the salaries of several of these factions. And so like we can't really, like there's no way, like people want to deny it, but the fact is that there's a documented history of Israel supporting the opposition. Why? Because at the end of the day, like Bashar al-Assad was like refusing to play ball with them. Although a lot of these opposition people were like, oh, Bashar al-Assad was a secret Israeli asset or something like this. And anyone who says that does not know the Assad family, like you can accuse them of crimes all you want, but to call them Israeli assets is just ridiculous. Like if you just know Hafez al-Assad, how he went crazy in 1973, like he took over in a coup in 1971, then 2 years later, he launched a war with Egypt against Israel. But we can't really understate like the Israeli involvement in this entire war. So going back to your original question, Like, will Syrians normalize? I think we have to remember, like, Syrians are exhausted from war, right? Like, they just want a simple life. They just want to eat. They want their children to live in safety. They want to have their simple lives. And so I don't think, like, it's far to say that maybe some Syrians, sometimes they look at Amman and Qahira, like Egypt and Jordan, a little bit of envy. They're like, oh, look, the Jordanians and the Egyptians normalized and they didn't suffer years of war, their cities getting leveled to the ground, their family members getting killed off one by one, to where your cemeteries are full and you're having to open up old graves to put more bodies, right? Like the like at the end of the day, like, we have to remember, Syrians are human beings, and there's a heavy cost of this resistance against Israel. So I don't think it's so far-fetched to say that maybe Syrians would accept the normalization deal if it comes if the result of it is that they can actually prosper for once. It's possible. But then there's also the Syrian pride, the pride that Syrians have in resisting for so long, of their love for Palestine, but like the torch they carry for this cause. So we could see it go either way. I think it ultimately depends on the conditions that they're faced with. Like, if the economic conditions don't improve enough to where it even justifies this normalization, then maybe they'll reject it. But we really just have to see how the Syrian people respond to it, because at the end of the day, right now, people care about feeding their children, whether they have jobs and stuff like that. Like, we have to be practical in these kinds of situations and just think about how it's going to impact them.
Rima, I do want to point something out to our viewers. You just touched up on Hafiz al-Assad and his stance against Israel and whatnot. But if someone's not familiar with you, on your X account, you do post that you're not an Assadist. You acknowledge the flaws and the corruption of the Assad regime. So do you want to elaborate a little bit about this on your stance and as a Syrian, and how you view this from whether it's pro-Assad, anti-Assad, or is it just there is no alternative?
So my political position, I can't say, it's ridiculous when people call me an Assadist, because I've never sat there and denied the real crimes that the government has done, right? But my thing is that I'm not a hypocrite. I'm not going to sit here and talk about Bashar al-Assad torturing people, right? So my father was tortured in prison under both Hafiz al-Assad in the 1970s and 1979. And then he was also imprisoned again in the early 2000s when he was visiting Syria, and tortured again. Okay, so I've never sat here and lied about the government torturing people or forcible disappearances. Because why? Because I know full well that it was happening. Okay, but my issue is when they say, oh, they kind of created this whole Holocaust-like narrative about Syria and about the Assad family to justify regime change. But then imagine this, right? Like, people like Salim Qassem and Muaz Mustafa were working with the US government, who killed 4.5 million people, according to Brown University's Cost of War project. The Great War of Terror in the region killed 4.5 million people, right? Most of those Muslims. 4.5 million people were killed by the US. And you have people like Salim Qassem working with congressmen like Joe Wilson, right, who's a very Zionist congressman. He got outraged when weapons deliveries to Israel were delayed last May during the genocide. Okay, working with him, thanking him, right? Screeching about Bashar al-Assad. Did she talk about Abu Ghraib? Does she talk about Guantanamo Bay that's still open? Does she talk about the 4.5 million people that the U.S. killed, or the tens of millions of other people that the U.S. traumatized, destroyed their lives, destroyed their homes, that were displaced by this war against the entire region? No, I hate the hypocrisy. Like, my issue has always been against the hypocrisy. I hate how they glorify Jabhat al-Nusra, right? Like, Jabhat al-Nusra committed horrific war crimes in Syria. They were sending suicide bombers to marketplaces. 2 days before October 7th, they sent drones. They did a bombing at the Homs Military Academy during the graduation ceremony, where there were civilians present. Okay, so the cadets were graduating, and they said over 100 people were killed, including civilians, because the attack happened when the people were in the courtyard taking pictures with their graduating cadets, right? Did Salim Qassem talk about this? Because this is terrorism. Right? Did they talk about the hell cannons that Jabhat al-Nusra was launching in Halab against civilian areas? Do they talk about the snipers? Do they talk about how Jabhat al-Nusra took all the food stores in eastern Halab and were starving people and giving fighters food before they were giving civilians, to the point that men were joining Jabhat al-Nusra just to secure food for their families? This happened to one of my cousins, right? I hate how they exaggerate the war crimes of Bashar al-Assad.
And you've had family killed during the 14-year proxy war, and most recently with the HTS takeover. Is this true?
Yes, I've had family that were killed on both sides. I had cousins that were conscripted and killed. I had family who were on the other side that were killed. One of my cousins passed away 2 days ago. He was killed in the bombing of Idlib on December 1st. The Russian and Syrian Air Force were bombing Idlib in response to the attack on Halab, and their home was bombed. One of my cousins was killed, and 15 other members of my family were wounded. I've never sat here and denied that war crimes were committed by the government, but I won't allow them to exaggerate it, to create like a Holocaust narrative. Some people say like 1 million Sunnis were killed. Like, my rational thinking brain is sitting there thinking, okay, even if 1 million people were documented as killed, how do you know what their religion was? Does everybody, when you check the body, it says Sunni on it? They were like saying Sunni genocide, all this stuff.
And a lot of reports show that a lot of that million, how many of them were actually soldiers?
So it wasn't even a million. According to the SOHR, which was once again was against the Assad government, it was around 600,000 people were killed. Okay, 170,000 of them were soldiers for the Syrian army. Imagine 170,000 of them were soldiers for the Syrian army. 160,000 were opposition combatants. Then of the civilian casualties, 75% of the civilian casualties were men. 25% were women and children. Now compare that to Gaza, where 70% of the people killed in Gaza are women and children. What does this tell you? And then we look at how SOHR has a record of masking combatant deaths as civilian deaths. So this explains why men were disproportionately represented amongst the civilian deaths, right? Like, it's very absurd. Like, why are there 75% of civilians killed, according to the SOHR? Why were they men? That tells us, okay, that men were being disproportionately targeted, right? So that means maybe, okay, maybe not all these men were actually civilians. Maybe a lot of them were combatants, or maybe there were, for example, in Halab, what al-Nusra would do is that they would pull people, like do checkpoints, and they would take your phone and check your phone. And then if they saw a picture of someone with a military uniform, if they saw something on your Facebook or anything like this, that kind of made them think that you had any loyalty to the Syrian government, they would just execute them. And then they would dump the bodies in the river and then say that Bashar al-Assad executed these people. This was a very common thing. They would execute people, accuse them of being shabiha, and then blame the government for it. Right? I have an aunt whose husband, he was shot in the street when he was going to the masjid to pray. And they left his body to rot in the street for weeks, and they wouldn't let anyone retrieve it. So there was no genetics. And eventually the bones just disappeared because the body decayed, right? And there was just bones, and they wouldn't let anyone go get it. And we don't know where those bones are, right? My cousins never got to bury their father. And now we see these mass graves that are turning up, and it's just a plot of dirt, right? It's just a plot of dirt. And you see these journalists saying there are 150,000 bodies here. Oh, did you exhume the bodies to count them? Do you know how do you know? If you're looking at a plot of dirt, tell me how you know. Do you have x-ray vision? How do you know there are 150,000 bodies here?
Rima, I have a question. I have a personal question. You mentioned your father was tortured. And now you mentioned that you have family members who've been killed and whatnot. Do you belong to a minority sect in Syria?
No, I'm a Sunni. My dad was Ikhwan, okay? So he was from the Muslim Brotherhood in the 1970s. He was part of what is called the Fighting Vanguard in English, or in Arabic, al-Ta'liya al-Muqattala. Okay? So I believe torture is wrong under every circumstance, right? I think it's haram. I will never support torture, even if it's against rapists and pedophiles and all this, right? I don't think it's just. But at the end of the day, we also have to acknowledge that imagine in America, a militant organization was created and they were committing sectarian killings, political assassinations, right? Using weapons, right, against the government, what would happen to them?
Yeah, absolutely.
Right?
No,
in the 1970s, the Ikhwan was a militant organization. They had committed, I think it's 200 to 300 political assassinations, right? But there's this hypocrisy where apparently if you're Sunni and you're committing sectarian killings or political assassinations, this is jihad, fi sabilillah, like whatever stuff they're making, you know? At the end of the day, they wanted political power. And so they were assassinating people, right?
Speaking on the sectarian lines, I have a question. There's a rise right now in torture and killings of the minorities in Syria, Shias, Alawites, Christians. Do you believe
Mhm.
Syria is gonna? And you also said, there is really no military capabilities to protect Syria. Do you think there'll be like an internal civil war or anything through a sectarian lens in Syria?
So I think whether a civil war will erupt will depend on the tolerance of the people to the violence that they're experiencing. I know a lot of Alawis, and even when their youth are being rounded up and being stepped on and forced to bark like dogs, they're still like, we're not going to do anything about it. Like, they don't want to make even more trouble because they know if they speak out against these sectarian killings, it could get a lot worse for them, right? Because they're the minority. They're not the ones in power. So they're hoping, the people I've talked to from the minority communities, they're hoping that if they keep quiet and they just take it, whatever they're facing, then eventually HTS will lay off, right? The way they see it is like, okay, they want revenge, right? So these are revenge killings, reprisal killings. And so they're like, okay, if we just take it for now, maybe eventually they'll cool down, they'll chill out, right? Once their bloodlust gets satisfied. So unfortunately, this is the mentality of a lot of these minorities that are being targeted, specifically the Alawis. And so I think whether the Alawis will take up arms or anything like this in defense of these sectarian killings, it depends on how bad it gets. Like and after 14 years of war, people have to remember this, like they have a very high tolerance for death. The same way the Lebanese in the Janub have a very high tolerance, right, for death. Like they've faced the force of Israel with the Dahiya doctrine targeting their civilians, right? So you have to remember, people in this region have a very high tolerance. So whether there will be a true civil war, and I know Syrian Shias too, who are very like, let's just stay as quiet as possible. Let's not incite people on social media, because they know like if it gets worse, more people will die, right? Like, and at the end of the day, we have to ask and remember, that like there's a sanctity to life, like you have to ask yourself whether it's worth it, right? If the cost of taking up arms is worth it. And this is one of my criticisms of the revolution is right is like was 14 years of death and destruction, of the killing and deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. Think of hundreds of thousands of young men were killed, right? Those are men who left their mothers, their fathers, they left their wives, their children became orphans, right? Was it worth it after 14 years? I think to a lot of Syrians it wasn't, right? Was it worth half of your cities being leveled to the ground, cities that have stood for thousands of years, right? Was it worth the loss of all your savings, your livelihoods, your jobs, the homes that have been in your family for generations are bombed out? Was it worth it? So if any war is going to erupt, I think it just depends on the tolerance of the people, how bad the killings get, if HTS can get a grip on them, because a lot of these killings are actually being done by foreign fighters who are part of HTS, for example, the Turkestan Islamic Party. So these are foreigners like Uyghurs, Tajiks, Turkestanis, Chechens, who don't really feel any kinship even with minority Syrians, where even like a Syrian who's a Sunni will feel some sort of kinship with another Syrian who's Alawi or Shia. Like at least they see their humanity. But imagine a foreign fighter who doesn't even speak the language, doesn't know anything about this village or their history or anything like this. They're not going to even have an ounce of mercy, right? Like they're full takfiris, Whereas like other Syrians, maybe they remember that before the war, there was no issue with us, right? We had no issue with them.
So with this being said, you're Syrian, your family's from Halab, you have family there, you belong to the majority sect in Syria that's Sunni. What is your message to the Syrian people during this difficult time? What is your final message to the Syrian people?
I hope they wake up before they get stuck under the thumb of a new dictator. I hope they realize that there are foreign powers who are licking their lips and rubbing their hands, wanting to take a bite out of them. I hope they realize who their true enemy is in the region and who's caused all the instability in this region for decades.
And who is
that? Israel and the U.S. empire that backs them, right? I hope they realize remember what's happening in Gaza, right? And not to ally with the supporters of the people in Gaza. I don't want to see more Syrians thanking Zionist congressmen. Imagine the humility, the shame for me to see people like Salim Qassam Hassan Shibli and all these other people thanking in the replies to Zionist Congressman Joe Wilson, thanking him. Thank you, Joe Wilson. The same man who was outraged when weapons got delayed to Israel, like one of the main backers of the Gaza genocide, you're thanking him? Like, have you no shame? I hope they remember who the true enemy is and actually try to regain some of their sovereignty and their self-respect and their dignity and stop kissing the boots of foreigners who only ever seek to use you as pawns. Realize that they have never had your best interests at heart. From Sykes-Picot until now, they've only sought to divide Syria, sought to divide Balad al-Sham. I hope they realize like greater Israel is in the works. It's happening before our eyes, you know, and if they don't wake up quickly, it's going to get very ugly very quickly, you know, and they need to be smart and they really need to assess the intentions of the people that they're helping, you know, remember that your honor and your dignity comes at a price, you know, and it shouldn't be cheap. You shouldn't be taking Qatari money after Qatar was funding Daesh for so many years, right? Now Qatar wants to come with their pipeline. At least if you're going to make these deals, make sure you're the victor out of them, right? Because at the end of the day, we all know what's going to happen in Syria is what happened in Iraq, right? Like the Iraqis don't even get their own oil revenue. The oil revenue goes into American banks, and every month the American banks give Iraq some of the money. But at any time, the American banks can cut off the flow of money to Iraq. So the Iraqis are ultimately beholden to America. Don't let this happen to you. You know, don't take out debt to the IMF. You know, like don't like it could get very ugly if people don't wake up soon. So I hope they wake up. I hope they realize that the world is plotting against them. I hope they stop the killing, stop the destruction, and stop giving blind loyalty to anyone, right? Like make sure that whoever you give your loyalty, that they have earned it through their actions, not just their words. You know, Jolani is going to say a lot of pretty things. He's gone through media training. Make sure his actions follow up with his words. Hold him accountable, right? If you want to hold accountable the people of the previous government, make sure you hold Jolani and al-Nusra accountable for what they did too. Because I see a lot of people who are just forgetting everything that they did for years, right? So yeah, this is my message to them. And ultimately, like I'm a Syrian, I want the best for all Syrians. Like regardless of sect or anything like this, I want the best for them because I'm not some evil person that just wants to see people suffer, you know, and I just hope everybody wakes up before it's too late.
Well, Rima, I commend you for your bravery and your courage with your posts on X. I see the way you go out there trying to push out, you know, your truth and what you see and what you're, and like I said, like you say many times, you don't want to be a hypocrite. So I commend you for that. And I want to thank you very much for joining us today on TMJ Talks.